A man once told me he could not breathe until he had $2 million. He was 51 years old. He earned more than $300,000 a year, wore a good suit, carried the tired authority of a person who had won enough in public that no one questioned whether he was succeeding. And yet when we sat down and talked, he sounded less like a winner than a man negotiating with an invisible hostage taker. The hostage was not his boss. It was not the economy. It was not inflation. It was not even really the number 2 million. It was the feeling that if he stopped now, if he softened, if he relaxed even a little, the whole structure of his future might collapse. I looked at the math. He already had about 1.2 million invested. He was not spending recklessly by the standards of his peer group, but he had trained himself to think like a man still climbing out of danger rather than a man who had already built a machine powerful enough to help him. If he never invested another dollar, and his capital compounded at a reasonable long-term rate, he would still likely end up with more than he thought he needed by traditional retirement age. He did not know that in his bones. That ignorance was expensive. It was costing him time, peace, and the ability to look at his own life honestly. I knew another person with the opposite problem. She had worked in a large technology company for years, saved hard, invested steadily, and reached her early 40s with a portfolio that had become large enough to carry more of the future than her paycheck did. Then she did something the world always finds suspicious when it is done calmly. She stepped off the obvious path. She took lower pay. She chose work that was lighter on the nervous system. The people around her thought she had become unserious. What they really meant was that she had started using math where they were still using fear. This is one of the least understood moments in financial life. There comes a point where your wealth story stops being driven mainly by what you put in and starts being driven by what is already there. Most people never notice when they cross that line. That is tragic, because crossing that line changes the meaning of work, risk, stress, and time. The conversation about retirement becomes deeper. The conversation about enough becomes sharper. The conversation about whether you are really still working, because you need to or because you no longer know how to stop, becomes impossible to avoid. I have spent most of my life thinking about capital, and I can tell you something very plainly. There are two engines in every wealth journey. The first engine is contribution. It is your labor translated into savings. It is the portion of the paycheck you refuse to spend. It is the monthly investment into the retirement plan, the brokerage account, the IRA, the broad index fund, the pile of ownership that begins small enough to look almost insulting in relation to the effort required to create it. The second engine is compounding. That one starts weak. At first it is barely visible. You have $10,000 invested and it earns $700 in a year. You are putting in much more than that by your own effort. So the compounding feels cute, almost decorative, like a child pretending to help carry groceries that are clearly being carried by you. Most people make the same mistake at that stage. They look at the weak little second engine and decide the whole enterprise is overrated. No, the enterprise is not overrated. They are simply too early to feel its force. Compounding is one of the most emotionally unfair forces in finance, because it asks for belief before it offers evidence that flatters the believer. That is why ordinary people quit too early. Not because the mathematics are bad, because the early emotional experience is unimpressive. The first years of serious investing often feel like you are doing all the work, and your money is doing almost nothing. That is not a flaw in the machine. That is the machine warming up. If you do not understand that, you will misread the early stage as failure. It is not failure. It is construction. This is why I care so much about the invisible line. There is a point, sometimes earlier than people imagine, when compounding stops being the smaller engine and begins carrying more of the total load than your contributions do. When that happens, something important shifts, not only the arithmetic, your relationship to your own life. I have seen people with no idea that they were already much closer to financial inevitability than their nervous system allowed them to believe. They kept behaving as though every future dollar had to be dug out of the ground by their own hands. That is not always true. At some point, if you have built enough capital and given it enough time, your own future stops depending mainly on how hard you keep shoveling, and starts depending more on the cap. That point deserves a name. I call it the crossover point. The phrase is simple, and the concept is even simpler. Your crossover point is the moment when your portfolio's annual growth is greater than the amount you are adding to it through fresh contributions. That is all, not mystical, not poetic, not a social media slogan. Just arithmetic. If you save $20,000 a year and your portfolio grows by only $7,000, then you are still the main engine. If that same portfolio later grows by 21,000, then the investment engine and the contribution engine are doing about equal work. If it grows by 35,000, then compounding has become the stronger partner. If it grows by 70,000 while you still contribute 20, then the entire psychology of the situation should change, because the machine you built is now carrying far more of the burden than you are. Let me slow that down with real numbers, because vague financial encouragement is not worth much. Suppose you save and invest $20,000 per year. That is already a strong savings rate for an ordinary household. Suppose your long-term annual return is 7% before inflation adjustments. At $100,000 invested, 7% gives you $7,000. Your own contributions are still doing most of the work. At $300,000 invested, 7% gives you $21,000. Now you are near the crossover point. Your labor and your capital are almost sharing the burden equally. 7% produces $35,000. Now compounding is the main character, and your fresh savings, though still useful, are no longer the dominant force. At $1 million, 7% produces $70,000. At that stage, a $20,000 annual contribution is still sensible, still worth doing, but emotionally it should no longer be treated as the reason the future exists. The future now exists mainly because prior decisions built enough mass for compounding to matter. This is the first great psychological transition in serious wealth building. The average person does not know where he stands relative to it. He only knows whether he feels stressed. And stress is a poor calculator. It has no talent for measuring what the machine is already doing underneath the surface. This is why I want people to stop thinking about saving only as a heroic act of deprivation and start thinking about it as the process of building enough capital, that eventually the capital becomes a true working partner. Once that happens, the rules change, not the laws of math. The meaning of your choices, a person below the crossover point, a person above it, has begun to be carried by the machine. There is a deeper level beyond that too, and this is where most of the world becomes confused. The crossover point is not the same thing as being financially finished. It does not mean you can quit all effort and float into the sunset. It means compounding has become stronger than your contributions. That is psychologically powerful. It is not the same thing as your retirement becoming inevitable, even if you add nothing else. For that, we need a second number. The second number is what people now like to call Coast FI. The label is modern, the concept is old. It is simply the amount of money you need invested today, such that if you never contributed another dollar, time and reasonable growth alone would still carry you to your retirement target by your chosen age. This is a much more profound number than most people realize. It is not early retirement in itself. It is not victory in itself. It is not permission to become foolish. It is, however, a kind of liberation from pressure. Once you have crossed your Coast FI number, you are no longer required to keep feeding the machine for the machine to eventually arrive where you intended. That changes many things. You can work less aggressively, you can choose a different career, you can start a business, you can care less about title and more about time. You can take a lower paying role that preserves your sanity without necessarily sacrificing your retirement. You can become much harder to bully. That is worth a great deal. People think money buys luxury first. Money, properly understood, buys leverage over your own choices. The stronger your capital base, the less cheaply the world can rent your time from you. Now, let me show you how to think about that number. Because the power is not in hearing a phrase. The power is in calculating your own reality. Begin with retirement spending, not fantasy spending, real spending. How much do you actually think you would want to spend in today's dollars each year in retirement? Let us say the answer is $60,000. Now subtract income sources that are not coming from selling assets, Social Security perhaps, maybe a small pension if you are lucky, rental income if it is dependable enough to count. Suppose those total $22,000, that leaves $38,000 that your portfolio must generate annually. If we use the familiar 4% guideline, then a portfolio around $950,000 could, under historical assumptions, support that need. That is your target portfolio. Now reverse it. If you are 38 years old and you want that $950,000 by age 60, you have 22 years for the money to work. If you assume something like a 5% real return after inflation over that period, then the amount you need right now to hit that target without any further contributions is roughly $325,000. That is your Coast FI number. Not because somebody online said so, because the arithmetic says so. If you already have $420,000 at age 38, then the odds are high that if left alone and sensibly invested, that sum becomes enough by age 60 without additional contributions. That does not mean you must stop contributing. It means you no longer need to in order for the long-range retirement plan to remain alive. Do you see the difference? One number changes the psychological weight of your contributions. The other changes the necessity of your contributions. Those are different ideas. Most people do not know either number. They are working harder than necessary or fearing more than necessary because they never did the arithmetic cleanly enough to see where they actually stand. The woman I mentioned earlier was in exactly that position. She was 38, earned well, had saved diligently for years, and reached a portfolio a little above $400,000. Her retirement goal was not wild. She did not need yachts. She did not need 6 houses. She wanted enough to live well, quietly, and without begging future employers to tolerate her into old age. She crossed her coast line and then did something the culture still finds suspicious. She downshifted not into irresponsibility, into agency. She did not stop working. She stopped working as though the highest paycheck automatically represented the best use of her life. That is a much more radical move than the public realizes. The public accepts exhaustion more easily than it accepts self-authored sufficiency. It is comfortable with hustle. It is less comfortable with the person who calmly says, "I have done enough mathematically that I no longer need to panic." That sort of sentence makes anxious people angry, because it exposes how little of their own pressure is still mathematical and how much is now identity. Now let me return to the 51-year-old lawyer. His case bothers me for a different reason. He had already built a portfolio around $1.2 million. He was still working weeks that no one should romanticize. 70. Her weeks are not evidence of virtue once you have enough. Sometimes they are evidence that you no longer know how to let your own life belong to you. He told himself 2 million was the real number. Fine. But if his current capital, left to compound without further contributions, was already on track to reach and likely surpass that figure within a reasonable time, then what exactly was he buying with more suffering? Some perhaps was he buying certainty a little more. Maybe was he buying freedom? No, that was the strange part. He already had enough structure to buy more freedom, and was using the structure to buy more pressure. That is what happens when a person never learns the difference between enough and everything. The market and the culture will always reward the confusion between the two. More income sounds like more progress. More title sounds like more total assets sounds like more intelligence. But if each step upward comes with a life that becomes narrower, more defended, more exhausting, and more dependent on the machine, then something else is happening. The assets are growing. The life may not be. This is why Kostai is more than a retirement concept. It is a mirror. It asks a painful question. If you have already reached a point where time and compounding can finish much of the job for you, why are you still behaving as though every future dollar must be extracted at maximum personal strain? Sometimes the answer is admirable, because the person loves the work, because he is building something larger than comfort, because he wants to give more than he wants to rest. Fine, I respect that. But very often the answer is less noble. He does not know who he is without the grind. He cannot distinguish between winning and working. He raised his lifestyle to the point where enough kept moving away from him. He lost the ability to trust a number because he never trained the deeper muscle of trusting sufficiency. This is where wealth becomes psychological rather than purely arithmetic. The source text you provided understands that instinctively it treats Kostai not as permission to be lazy, but as the moment pressure can be separated from necessity. That is exactly right. Pressure is not always financial after a certain point. It becomes emotional, social, and self-created. There is a trap hidden inside this realization, though, and I want to be honest about it, I call it the 1 more year trap. A person reaches the Kostai number or something close to it. He realizes that if he keeps working a few more years, the cushion gets much bigger. That is mathematically true. At this point, the logic often sounds irresistible. 1 more year, then another, a bigger buffer, more safety, more room, all sensible on paper. But life has a habit of changing while the person is still running the spreadsheet. The nicer car arrives, then the nicer neighborhood, then the larger house, then the children's lifestyle expands, then the vacations become more expensive because the people around him now vacation expensively. Then the identity shifts from I am building freedom to I am maintaining a standard. Once that happens, The coast-I number moves. The target moves because the spending moved. Now the person who had mathematically won discovers he has re-entered the race by inflating the shape of his own life. This is one of the saddest patterns in money because it is so quiet and respectable. The person says he is simply improving his life. Maybe he is. He is also, very often, trading freedom for polish. And polish is a poor substitute for freedom. I do not say this as a monk. I am not interested in people living like hermits if their lives can support more. I am interested in them understanding what additional lifestyle really costs. A higher spending level does not merely cost this year's dollars. It raises the size of the machine required to support that spending forever. Every new fixed expectation becomes a future salary that must be purchased in advance with capital. That is why I care so much about lifestyle discipline. It is not because simple living is morally pure. It is because freedom is more affordable when the life itself is not bloated. The more expensive your life becomes, the more capital you need before coast-I means anything. A person spending $45,000 a year is playing one game. A person spending $120,000 is playing another. The market does not care which game you chose. The capital requirement does. This is why some people with $2 million still feel trapped, while others with far less feel light. The difference is not just the size of the portfolio, it is the appetite of the life wrapped around it. I once heard a parable about a fisherman in Mexico. A banker visiting on vacation sees the fisherman return with enough fish for the day and asks why he does not stay out longer. Catch more, scale up, buy more boats, build a fleet, go public, and eventually retire so he can spend his days fishing peacefully. The fisherman says, I already do that now. The lesson is not that ambition is foolish. It is that people often build huge machines to purchase conditions. They could have lived much earlier in simpler form. Again, I am not romanticizing poverty. The fisherman's story is too easily abused by people who do not understand the economic realities of health costs, children, long life, housing, and modern obligations. What I am saying is narrower and more precise. Do not let the machine outrun the purpose. Once capital can carry enough of the future, it becomes very important to ask what you are still running from and what you are still running toward. Now let me offer a more practical framework, because arithmetic without application is just entertainment for the financially literate. First, calculate both numbers, your crossover point and your coast-I number. Do not wave your hands at them. Do not guess. Do not rely on a feeling. Run the numbers. Use reasonable assumptions. Do not use fantasy returns. Use real returns after inflation when you are projecting the future purchasing power of a portfolio. If you are below the crossover point, then your contributions still matter enormously. That is not discouraging. It is clarifying. It means your main job is still to feed the machine, work well, save steadily, automate the investing. Keep fixed costs sane enough that contributions can continue through difficult periods. You are in the construction phase, respect it. If you are above the crossover point but below coast-FI, then you are in a powerful middle stage. Compounding is now more visible. You are no longer pushing alone, but your continued contributions still shorten the road meaningfully. This is often the most psychologically dangerous stage, because the account starts feeling alive, and people become tempted to get clever. Do not. A larger account is not a license to become a worse steward. If you are above coast-FI, then the emotional work begins. Not because the math gets harder, because the story gets harder. Now you must decide what money is for. Do you keep pushing because you genuinely want to? Do you slow down? Do you change careers? Do you buy more time? Do you take the sabbatical? Do you finally stop confusing salary with self-respect? Those are not spreadsheet questions. Those are life questions. But you cannot answer them honestly if you never did the spreadsheet first. The spreadsheet does not tell you how to live. It tells you what you are free to consider. That is already a tremendous gift. The source text uses the metaphor of two horses pulling a carriage up a mountain. I understand the appeal of that image. I think of it slightly differently. In the beginning, you are carrying water uphill in buckets. It is tiring. The progress is visible but discouragingly small. Then, eventually, you build a canal. Once the canal starts running, the same gravity that once seemed indifferent begins helping you. If you never build the canal, you keep carrying buckets forever and call that adulthood. If you build the canal but never notice it exists, you may still keep carrying buckets from habit long after the landscape has changed. Both mistakes are common. Neither is necessary. Let me also speak to the older worker who feels he may have started too late. People often hear conversations like this and misinterpret them cruelly. They think, if I did not begin young, then I already lost. No, the point is not that every path is equal. They are not time matters. But clarity matters too. A 50-year-old who suddenly understands his true number can still make far better decisions than a 50-year-old operating only on vague fear. Maybe he works longer than he hoped. Fine. Better a few more years with clarity than 10 more years governed by a phantom target he never examined. Maybe he downsizes earlier. Maybe he changes roles. Maybe he stops overfunding the wrong lifestyle. Maybe he realizes he does not need 2 million to breathe. Maybe he needs a smaller life with stronger margins. That kind of realization can save a decade even when it comes late. Late wisdom still has value. It just has less runway than early wisdom. That is true of all things. Now I want to say something about enough, because this word seems to frighten ambitious people. They hear enough and think surrender. I hear enough and think control. An investor with no concept of enough is condemned to work for numbers that move away from him as quickly as his appetite grows. He is like a man chasing the horizon with excellent shoes. He may appear impressive. He does not arrive. Enough is not anti-growth. Enough is the line that allows growth to become chosen rather than compulsory. A person who knows his enough can still build more, give more, risk more, create more if he wants. The difference is that he is no longer being driven purely by confusion. He is choosing. Choice is the entire point of wealth. Without choice, large balances are just polished forms of dependence. I have seen very rich people with no real sense of enough. They do not enjoy their money. They guard it, compare it, chase larger versions of it, and remain haunted by the possibility that stopping would reveal some emptiness they have successfully postponed for years. That is not a financial problem. It is a life problem wearing expensive clothing. This is why I always return to the same phrase. Money is stored optionality, not trophies, not identity, not applause optionality. The invisible line matters because crossing it means optionality has begun to outrun effort. That is a remarkable transition. It deserves to be noticed. Not because everyone should quit work, because people should at least know when the machine they built has become strong enough to offer them a real choice. If you never calculate it, you will never know. And if you never know, you may keep paying with time for a fear that the numbers would have already dismissed. That is too high a price. I do not want people to retire into emptiness. I do not want them to stop building, if building is the great joy of their life. I simply want them to know the truth of their position. The truth can be liberating in both directions. Below the line, it tells you to keep going with clarity and discipline. Above the line, it tells you that the future may now contain more authorship than you thought. Both are useful. Ignorance is not. So calculate the line, calculate the target, calculate the gap. Then sit with the answer long enough that you stop thinking of retirement as one giant dramatic jump and start thinking of it as a gradual increase in leverage over your own time. That is much more accurate. That is also much more humane, because many people do not need to retire immediately to improve their lives. They need to know that they no longer have to tolerate certain forms of misery. They need to know a paying job they would actually enjoy would not destroy them. They need to know that the sabbatical is not a reckless act. They need to know that 1 year off is not financial suicide. They need to know that the machine can now carry more than they realized. That knowledge changes how a person sits in meetings, how he negotiates, how he sees Monday, how he treats his own mind. That matters. There are a great many people in the world who would not be happy doing nothing. I understand that very well. I would have been a terrible man to tell never work again. But there is an enormous difference between continuing to work because work is meaningful and continuing to work because you never bothered to find out whether the panic was still mathematically justified. One is purpose. The other is inertia. Inertia is one of the great invisible tyrants of adult life. People keep doing the same thing, not because it is right, but because the structure was never interrogated carefully enough to reveal that alternatives had become available. That is why I care about this subject so much. Not because early retirement is a religion, because self-knowledge in finance is rare and precious. The market has 100 ways to confuse you. Your own numbers should not be one of them. If you build well, save long enough, keep costs sane, and let time work. There may come a day when your future stops depending mainly on your next contribution and starts depending mainly on the capital that is already in place. That day is real. It is not fantasy. It is not only for the rich. It is not even as far away from many, but it must be calculated, then recognized, then used wisely. That is the sequence. And if you do that, you gain something far greater than a catchy financial label. You gain the right to stop lying to yourself about what is necessary. That is a very valuable right. Perhaps the most valuable one money can buy.